Today's story might just teach you about stranger danger. If you are as intrigued by the incredible and the unexplained as I am, then make sure to sit on that like button, headlock that subscribe, and give a noogie to that bell so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. So this story takes place in the 2000s with a girl named Molly. She was about 18 at the time, and she had just gotten out of a long-term relationship with a boyfriend for about 4 years that she had been cheated on for the majority of the time. So she was on kind of a mission to prove to the world that she didn't need to depend on anybody. She could take care of herself. She had just moved into her first apartment. She was basically feeling like she was breaking away from the chains that were confining her. So because of this, she started hanging out with people that she wouldn't usually hang out with. But this night, she decides to go hang out with her friend Shelly and Shelly's boyfriend. So she goes with Shelly over there to the house. She walks in and they all get acquainted. Shelly's boyfriend's friend, Steve, was introduced to Molly. This night in particular, because Molly was pretty upset from the days prior, she decided that she's going to be a little more carefree. So she starts partying with Shelly, her boyfriend, and their friend Steve for a few hours until Shelly and her boyfriend turn in for the night. So because it was just Molly and Steve, Molly starts to feel awkward, and then she asks Steve to drive her home. At this point, Steve tries to talk Molly out of it. He starts making excuses like he doesn't have gas, his tires are flat, it's late, blah, blah, blah. But Molly was to the point to where her ex was texting her and she was starting to be in her feelings, and she wanted to text him at her own place, in her own environment. So finally, Molly tells Steve that she'll give him like $60 just to drive her home, which is well over what it would cost gas to drive her. When they had gotten about halfway to Molly's place, she gets another text from her ex that says something along the lines of, "I miss you." As Molly went to text back, Steve looked over as he was driving and he screams, "You have a boyfriend? Why didn't you tell me you have a boyfriend?" He was talking as if he had known Molly for years or they were in some kind of relationship, but they weren't. They had just met literally hours before this moment. And the way that Steve was reacting made Molly want to get away from him even more, even faster. But now Steve was driving like a maniac. He was driving erratically. He was speeding, and it was pitch black. Still speeding like a maniac, Steve whipped his car into this parking lot and threw it into park. Now, completely terrified, Molly starts screaming, "I'll call the police! I'll call the police! Let me out!" So Steve rips her phone out of her hand and snaps it in half. Mind you, he's laughing like a complete lunatic. Molly goes, I'll scream as loud as I can." But they're in the middle of an empty parking lot at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So deep down, Molly knows that screaming isn't going to do her much of any good. So at this, Steve, even more crazy than before, starts laughing again. And he points just beyond Molly's shoulder. And he goes, "You see those woods over there? Yeah, those woods right across the field? That's where I'm going to bury your body." And in this moment, complete cold-blooded fear rose up in Molly's throat. And she knew that if she didn't get out now, her body was going to be found in a ditch, or never found at all. Before Steve could say another word, Molly slammed the door open and she just took off running. Her flip-flops made her start to trip. She started to stumble for a second. She kicked him off. She had a bag. She threw it, and she just ran. She ran like her life depended on it. She stopped for a second when she got behind a house, and she listened to see if Steve was behind her. but all she could hear was him screaming and calling her names and yelling and just completely freaking out. So she took off running again, full speed. She was cutting through yards, she was cutting through parking lots, she was running across the street. She had no intentions of looking at her surroundings. All she had in her mind was she had to get home. So finally, she found her apartment complex. She ran all the way through it to the back. Her apartment was on the second floor. So when she found her right apartment, she had to run up an entire flight of stairs and then basically break into her own apartment because she didn't have her keys, she didn't have phone, she didn't have her wallet, she didn't have anything. And finally, when she got in, she almost barricaded herself inside her apartment. For the next 12 hours, Molly slept. Anytime that she would wake up, she would just go right back to sleep. A few days or a week or two had gone by, and she slowly started replacing the things that she lost. You know, the money she made back at her job, she had to replace her license, she had to replace her phone. But not too much time had passed when she started receiving texts on her phone. They were always from random numbers, and no matter how many times she blocked them, the same kind of text would pop up from a different number right after. She would get phone calls at all hours of the night, and all the messages and all the texts were the same thing. I miss you, baby. Why are you ignoring me? And things like that. A month had passed, and she had just learned to ignore these calls and ignore these messages before they started turning dark. They started turning into threats and just nasty messages that she didn't want to hear. She also started noticing that when she would come home late at night, it didn't matter what time it was. It would be 1, midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. There would always be a car parked in front of the building that her apartment was in. And this car was the same car every time. Because she never got close enough, she couldn't tell what the make or model was, but she knew it was a dark car, and the person did the same thing each night. They would just sit there without moving in the driver's seat, but to Molly, it just looked like a dark silhouette of a person. She got used to it after a while. But these messages and phone calls were starting to really bother her. So she decided that her and a friend would go out to a little party for the night. Her and her friend partied, hung out with people, and once the sun came out, they decided that they better go sleep everything off and wake up the next day refreshed. So it was about 6 a.m. when Molly and her friend got back to her apartment. They were laughing, talking about the night before and all the funny things they did and things people said and so on. Well, Molly was walking up to the top of the stairs. Her apartment was to the left, and she was getting her keys out to open the door when she heard her friend kind of gasp behind her. When she looked up, at first Molly didn't notice anything, but then when she got to where her door should be, there was no door. The door of her apartment was laying on its face on the ground inside of her apartment, and the door frame around her door was shredded on the floor. So at this point, Molly knew that they weren't getting any sleep tonight because now she had to call the police. Finally, about an hour later, the police show up. They start looking around. They start asking Molly, is anything taken? Has anything been moved? She had animals inside the house that had not been disturbed. They were expensive animals, and they hadn't even been bothered. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken besides her door. So this police officer pulls Molly aside and he says, look, we're taking fingerprints, we're taking pictures, the apartment management is going to fix your door. He was like, and I don't mean to scare you, miss, but I think it's a good thing that you weren't home when this happened, because in my experience, when things like this happen, the intruder wasn't here to steal from you. He was here to get to you. So after the police and the apartment management people leave, those words that the officer said keep replaying in Molly's head. And that's when it dawned on her that she had had a gut feeling not to be home this night. She had this weird nagging intuition that she needed to be gone. And I'm starting to think that this might have saved Molly's life. But what do you think? Do you think that it was her intuition? Do you think that somehow deep down she knew that the messages were escalating and that's why she left? Or do you think it was something else? And the person that was sitting in the car with the headlights, do you think it was them? Do you think it was Steve? Let me know in the comments. Also, what would you have done in this situation? Put your reply in the comments, or you can always email me at tellmeaboutittv@gmail.com. You can also send requests, suggestions, or personal experiences to that email. And make sure to sit on that like button, headlock that subscribe, and give a noogie to that bell so you don't miss any of my weekly videos. And if you have any personal experiences or requests or suggestions, make sure to send me an email at tellmeaboutittv@gmail.com.